All right, welcome everybody to the new year. Com2us is going to be giving us a free Nat 5 in this new year for the first week of new content in January. The Beetle Knight will be free in the monster story, I believe, in the update this coming Wednesday, January 4th. I'll go over the skills, my review of them, and a little bit of intelligence from the Korean servers on what of these units to summon. So let's get right into it. As you can see, we have all 5 standard elements here of the Beetle Knight. The Beetle Knight is going to be a knight class across all the elements with the exception of the dark, that will be a warrior class. So I'll go through each of the individual skills and then I'll talk a little bit about the similarities between the Beetle Knight family, also give some information on how the Koreans are either utilizing or not utilizing each of the elements. And so hopefully at the end of this video, you'll be able to know exactly which Beetle Knight to summon, which one to potentially not go for, and how to potentially leverage them once they are released in North America. So S1 basic attack is going to be a multi-hit with a multiplier of 100% attack as damage once you are fully skilled up. We're only going to talk about max skill ups in this video. So this is going to be the same S1 across every single one of the Beetle Knights regardless of element. Multi-hitter, 100% of attack multiplier. S2 is going to be Lance Charge, and Lance Charge is also similar across the family. For the Fire Beetle Knight, it's going to have a multiplier from both attack and defense. So similar to the Wind Ifrit that has a multiplier on attack and HP, this seems to be intended to be more of a bruisery unit that can have both damage output and have a good amount of survivability through the defense substats. It charges forward at an enemy within an area, so it's an AoE effect in the charge. Applies airborne with a certain chance and applies provoke with a certain chance. So the airborne is nice. If you don't know what airborne is once it lands, your unit or summoner that was targeted flies into the air, falls down on the ground, and needs a moment to recover on the ground before they can start moving, dashing, or using skills again. So it is a fairly effective short-term CC, unlike other CCs where you can still run around or you can potentially still use your S1 if you're silenced. When you are airborne, you are completely immobilized and you can't use any skills. Now, the duration is much shorter than some other CC effects, but can still be very effective. There is only a 62% chance, so even after the 62% chance was met, there is still going to be an accuracy resistance check on airborne. Similarly for Provoke, Provoke is very powerful in PvP, especially for units that especially for comps where you're bringing units that are a little bit squishier. For example, if you're running Orbia or if you are running a segment, you don't want your segment to be nuked down right away. So having Provoke can be very helpful. There is an 82% chance condition put against this Provoke though. We do see a lot of units that do not have a probability condition against their Provoke. For example, the Wind Penguin Knight, Mav, has a 100% chance of Provoke so long as it can pass the accuracy and resistance check of the target in itself. So there is a condition on the Provoke, but overall, charges forward, applies within an area, airborne chance, Provoke chance, and does damage based on both attack and defense. That's the S2. Most of the Beetle Knights will have some form of a Lance Charge as their S2, where they charge forward, potentially land airborne, and then apply some other debuff or buff to the team. S3, Iron Shield. This is a damage mitigation that is AoE, so applies level 2 attack down and crit damage down for 16 seconds within an area. I think this skill is potentially very powerful. It's a 4 mana cost, so at the open of a fight, if you get to 10 mana, for example, you can spam this twice. That would be 4 attack down, 4 crit damage down for 16 seconds, which can essentially neutralize a Orbia or some type of DPS unit like a Sekhmet or a Karambit or a Lupinus. So this, if it lands properly, could potentially help the survivability of your team. Beetle Knights also have a passive. So this passive makes the Beetle Knight immune to Provoke, which is great, especially if you're fighting against something like a Cleef that is going to provoke very constantly. If you're fighting something like a Taeor that is currently in the meta in Korea, Provoke is a big debuff being used in PvP rankings right now, and so having a unit that's immune to Provoke can offer an additional challenge to your opposing team. So immune to Provoke, and if a team gets a beneficial effect removed or stolen, it uses Hellfire Charge on the target that removed or stole that effect. So I'm sure you are all thinking about Sekhmet right now. That is infamous for stealing beneficial effects and nuking down people in PvP arena, whether that be Battlefield or Challenge or Brawl. So in that scenario, if Sekhmet steals a beneficial effect or strips a beneficial effect, such as from Juno or from Chiwu, the Beetle Knight will use Hellfire Charge on that Sekhmet, Juno, or Chiwu that stripped the buff from your team. Hellfire Charge, what does that do? Well, it charges towards the enemy, deals damage based on defense, removes all beneficial effects on the target, and silences them with a certain chance. Damage is increased based on the number of beneficial effects that that target has. So it essentially, Uno reverses card on the Sekhmet or the Juno or the Chiwu. Beetle Knight will charge that unit that stripped the beneficial effect from your team, deal damage based on attack and defense once again, increase damage if it steals back, if it strips back debuffs from the Juno or the Chiwu or the Sekhmet, and silences for 11 seconds. So I think off the bat, most people immediately think, wow, the Fire Beetle Knight seems to be very powerful. It has a provoking airborne chance on its S2. It has a significant damage mitigation AoE skill on its S3. And it has a passive that can allow it to counter strips and beneficial effect steals, which in the current meta happens very often behind the Juno comps and the Sekhmet comps. Now, that's what everybody in Korea thought at the release of the Beetle Knight as well. Unfortunately, in practice, the Fire Beetle Knight has not been an effective counter to something like a Sekhmet. The reason being is Sekhmet's beneficial effect steal skill has a much wider range than what the passive of the Fire Beetle Knight has, which means oftentimes Sekhmet will still steal your buffs, but the Fire Beetle Knight is out of range to get his Hellfire Charge triggered. And so the kit sounds incredibly promising to be viable in the current meta and to counter something like a Sekhmet. But the range of this passive has made it a little bit ineffective, and so people aren't really using it in Korea, even though they were very excited at first during the release. Maybe they'll buff the range in the future, I'm not entirely sure, but regardless, this is the free unit in the monster story, so we will all have him in case he gets buffed. I would love to see a good Sekhmet Juno counter be released. This guy seems to have the kit for it if they can just adjust the range of what will activate his passive a little bit more in the future. Okay, so that's the Fire Beetle Knight. The family rundown is S1 is always going to be a multi-hit. S2 is always going to be a charge that also lands some type of debuff or buff. S3 is going to be some type of AoE effect that either debuffs or buffs your own party, and then they will all have some type of passive. Moving on to water. Water is probably the talk of the town because the rumors have been going on that water is the best one to get. We'll go through why that is. S1 is exactly the same, multi-hit, attack damage multiplier. S2 charge, so remember, the Fire Beetle Knight had a charge with airborne and provoke. The Water Beetle Knight has a charge with airborne and defense down, and there is no probability condition to apply the level 2 defense down for 16 seconds. It also is very consistent with the Fire one. The damage multiplier is based on both attack and defense. The airborne rate is exactly the same, and so the only difference between Fire and Water is Fire has a probability to land provoke. Water lands level 2 defense down. Iron Shield, so applies move speed down to an area and also applies crit res up and continuous recovery to allies. So this is once again a AoE type effect that lands debuffs and buffs. The debuff is going to be level 2 move speed down to the enemy, and then level 1 crit res up and continuous recovery to the allies. Remember, the Fire Beetle Knight, his AoE was damage mitigation. He landed level 2 debuffs on attack down and crit damage down to the enemy. The Water Beetle Knight has a little bit more survival, sustain, move speed down to the enemy, crit res up, and continuous recovery to the allies. The passive is what we really need to talk about. And this is where every single Orbia needs to give this video your full attention, because we finally have our own version of Endure. Beetle Knight becomes imbued to provoke. That's the same as the Fire. When the summoner takes death-inflicting damage, ignores the damage, then applies Endure to the summoner and recovers the summoner's HP. That recovery amount is based on the target's max HP. So the passive of the Water Beetle Knight allows Orbias or any other summoner to ignore fatal damage, death-inflicting damage, and then gets an Endure buff. And we all know that with the new patch, Endure is getting buffed, and the summoner recovers about 50% of HP. So now if your Orbia is getting killed, the last hit that is supposed to kill your Orbia will be ignored. And then Beetle Knight will apply Endure to Orbia and recover Orbia's HP. And you have that Endure on for 14 seconds. So that means you have 14 seconds at 47% health to either get back to full health or to survive the fight unless the enemy strips the Endure. So to me, this is game-changing for Battlefield PvP and Brawl. This is a unit that will significantly improve squishy summoners' survivability and ability to maneuver within the arena without always having to worry about the sustained part of survival. So this is the reason why Water Beetle Knight has been so prevalent in the Korea servers for Orbia players. We do see Water Beetle Knight being used in the rankings. It is a relatively easy unit to counter, but it does force your opponent to have to think about counters if you're bringing Water Beetle Knight in Brawl. I personally main a Orbia and am very much looking forward to the Water Beetle Knight. I will be saving my scrolls immediately for this guy, and this is definitely a must pull. Water Beetle Knight. Okay, S1, same thing. 100% attack multiplier, attacks 2 times. S2, so remember, S2 is always going to be some type of charge. Fire is a charge that lands provoke with the chance. Water is a charge that lands level 2 defense down. Wind is a charge that lands silence for 12 seconds with a very odd condition, a condition of if the target has electric shock. So there is a fairly large condition that the target must have the electric shock dot on that unit in order for the silence to land. So there you have it. Iron Shield, remember, S3 is always going to be some type of AoE effect that applies buffs or debuffs. Applies level 2 defense up to allies. And then a provoke with a certain chance to the enemy. So S3 for fire was damage mitigation. S3 for water was move speed down and sustain. S3 for the wind is defense down and provoke. So all kind of similar structures for S3 and S2 for the Beetle Knights, but with different effects within them. Now let's talk about the passive. Immune to provoke. By the way, all of these guys, their passive makes them immune to provoke. That's a consistent factor across the 3. When attacked by the enemy, replaces defense up that the enemies within the area have with defense down. So very similar to something like the Water Lich. And discharges lightning that applies electric shock. Okay, so now we're starting to understand why there is an electric shock condition for the silence to work in S2. So it becomes immune to provoke like all of them have, replaces defense up with defense down, and applies electric shock. This is very interesting because this is a passive that will continuously apply electric shock every 10 seconds without any mana cost. So this is the first dot damage over time unit that I've seen that can apply dots on its passive. And if that passive lands, having a 10-second silence at a 3 mana cost with an airborne rate could potentially be very, very useful. Okay, let's get into the light and dark. So S1 is going to be the same, 2 times attack, 100% multiplier. The charge. So the charge is going to be a little bit different than our elementals, the fire, wind, and water. It still does its charge, but it removes a beneficial effect rather than has a probability of airborne. And then, if there is no beneficial effect, blocks beneficial effects for 16 seconds. So it either strips one buff or it gives the debuff a beneficial effect block. So it doesn't have the airborne chance that fire, water, and wind has, but it has a pretty powerful stripping mechanism. So the AoE effect here increases the level of all beneficial effects on nearby allies and provokes enemies within the area with a certain chance. Also applies continuous recovery to all allies that don't already have continuous recovery. Wow, this feels incredibly broken. So it has an AoE increase of duration of beneficial effects. Or not duration, sorry, stacks. Increases the level of beneficial effects of all allies within the area by not one, but by 2. So if you have a single defense buff or a crit damage buff, just level 1 of it, when the Light Beetle Knight does his S3, that level 1 crit damage buff all of a sudden becomes level 3. And this can be insane if you have a team composition that has synergy to apply buffs and you're using S3 at the same time. It also has a chance for provoke on its S3. 82% rate, so there is that probability condition, but it not only increases the stacks of the buffs on your team, it has a chance to provoke, and it also applies continuous recovery. This is a kit that is incredibly unique and feels like it would be very, very powerful in any arena situation, regardless of which summoner you play. The passive becomes immune to provoke like the rest of them and removes a beneficial effect on the target with the chance when attacked by an enemy. This is another incredibly OP passive. Every time that the Beetle Knight gets attacked, for every 6 seconds, it has a chance to remove a beneficial effect on that unit that attacked. And remember, this guy provokes, right? We have a chance to provoke for 10 seconds. So if you successfully land this provoke and all of the enemy team is focusing the Beetle Knight, you are then going to start automatically removing beneficial effects, 55% rate, once every 6 seconds, but you now have a chance to also remove beneficial effects. Not only that, but S2 also strips and blocks beneficial effects if the opposing target has no debuffs. So S2 can strip and block beneficial effects. S3 can provoke and increase beneficial effect duration of your team and increase recovery. And then the passive continues to strip over time if the unit is attacking the Light Beetle Knight. If I got to summon an LD5, I know I won't, but this one would be it. When you ask the Koreans which Beetle Knight is worth it, they will come back to you and say Light is the #1 to get. If you pull a Light Beetle Knight, you've won the lottery. That is the best unit within the family to summon. So there you have that guy. Dark Beetle Knight, same thing. S1 multi-hit, 100% multiplier. S2 is going to be a charge, but applies poison. So similar multiplier on attack and defense, similar airborne rate. Rather than provoke or defense down or strip, it applies poison. Or excuse me, explodes poison. Which is really important to note with the new Seal Raid. S3, the AoE effect, applies poisons to enemies in the area and has a certain chance to fear if the target has a dot. So for those who don't know fear is, if you're fighting Naraka in Boiling Waterfall, when you first run into the entry of the raid and he does his roar and everybody runs away automatically, that is fear. The fear mechanic is a debuff that is very short, 4.5 seconds, that makes units and summoners run away kind of randomly. And during that time, you can't control your unit, you can't use skills, you're just kind of running around automatically. So that's what fear is. So S2 is the charge that explodes poison. S3 is a AoE level 2 poison that also has a chance to fear if the target already has a dot applied to them. The passive is immune to provoke, like all of them are. Increases the summoner's ultimate gauge every time the Beetle Knight successfully lands a crowd control effect on the enemy, and applies poison to the target when attacked by an enemy. So every time that the Dark Beetle Knight gets attacked, he will have a chance to land poison for 25 seconds every 3 seconds. So if he landed a successful provoke, very likely people are going to be attacking the Dark Beetle Knight and getting the poison debuff on themselves. He will also, when applying CC to enemy, increase ultimate gauge of the summoner by 5%. So the ultimate gauge, I think there is mixed reviews about how many people are investing into the ultimate, because there is a lot of RNG based on when you can use your ultimate. But this should certainly help, and I think there can be a lot of theory crafting involved in how to truly utilize the Dark Beetle Knight. The Dark Beetle Knight is useful in the Seal raid, so the new 6-man dungeon that was released with the Stone Giant, because he is one of the only units that can explode poison. In the Seal raid, you want to land a bunch of dots because the boss only takes damage from damage over time. You want to land a 10 stack, but once you land a 10 stack, you can't do any more damage with that particular buff. So if you have 10 stacks of poison, you're capping yourself on damage output from poison, unless you have something like Explode. Explode essentially looks at how many stacks of that debuff is there on the enemy and explodes all of them and does all the damage instantaneously rather than over time. The great thing about Explode is it resets the threshold. So you get to 10 stacks, you explode, you use all the damage, and then you can restack poison once again, versus have to wait for the 10 stacks to expire organically. So when I asked the Koreans what they thought, they said the Dark Beetle Knight is one of the worst LD5s in the game at this point. So I don't think anybody has been effective in theory crafting how this ultimate gauge increase could come into play. Poison, I think, is a relatively rare dot, so there's no immediate synergies that are obvious that comes to mind. So maybe he's going to get a buff in the future, but if you had to choose between the light or the dark, definitely choose the light. People weren't super hot on the Dark Beetle Knight in the Korean server. Okay, so there you have it. Beetle Knight family coming Jan 4th, Wednesday update, I believe. We're going to get the free one in the Fire monster story. Everybody look out for that. If you play Orbia, start saving your scrolls, because you can now have your own version of Endure. This is going to be a major pivot point in the PvP arena for people who do have a Water Beetle Knight. So definitely try and get this guy. The rest of them, Koreans think they're pretty average. You see the wind one very infrequently in PvP, but he's very easy to counter. The light one is godly, but very hard to summon. And the dark one is pretty trash. So there you have it. Good luck, everybody.